Welcome, everybody. See lots of people joining us. So great to see so many of you today. Just going to give everybody a couple minutes to join. But in the meantime, really lovely to see so many clients joining. Fantastic. Welcome. And lots of old friends looking through the list of people who've already joined us, and a lot of new ones as well. So I can tell you by the response that we've had for this webinar, we certainly know that this issue of global sustainability standards is really top of mind for a lot of you today. And that idea that we're going to come up with a consistent and comparable reporting for companies across jurisdictions. This, in theory, should simplify things for both corporates and investors, something I know that many of you will really welcome.
Oh, right. Okay, yeah, but you can take it down in a minute, aren't you? So.
As many of you will probably know, I'm a passionate advocate of and nudger of companies to move in this direction, and not just to have a sustainability strategy and a financial or a corporate strategy, but to have a sustainable business strategy. So I'm super excited that this will help to drive change internally and externally about businesses today. So super excited. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Sally Pilot, and I welcome you on behalf of Black Sun, Stakeholder Communications Company. We're super happy to be part of this debate. I run our advisory research and external engagement. As part of that, I sit on the FRC Stakeholder Advisory Board and also the board of the IR Society. So I'm really engaging around these debates and really trying to understand how we can best help companies navigate their way through this field. For those of you that didn't join the earlier session, there was an earlier session that I just wanted to feed back on the similar topic with the IFRS and actually Sue Lloyd, who's with us today. And it was with the FRC and BAYS. And I wanted to feed back because I really wanted to set the context for this session today. I'm really hoping that this session, as I know that everybody is joining us, is a preparer, very involved in the annual report process. I think a lot of you that have joined are probably quite new to standards. So I'm hoping that Sue and Jonathan will be able to sort of explain and make it a lot more accessible and understandable in terms of what they mean and what the impact will be internally. But I did want to give you the context for what I heard this morning at the session. And really there's two things. The government will announced this morning in the session earlier that they will look to bring forward legislation to mandate the use of UK adopted international sustainability standards. Okay, so that's the message from government, that they will be adopting ISSB standards. So I think that's really important to keep in the back of your mind. They will be doing a consultation on the scope, assurance, implementation later in the year, and they will use that as an opportunity to really use ISSB and what comes out of this consultation to streamline requirements and relook at the strategic report, and to ensure that we develop a framework which is suitable for use for many years to come. That was the message, many years to come. So I'm really looking forward to that, because I think that would be really helpful. The other thing to note is the FRC also, as you well know, fully support the ISSB and will be doing a lot of work to support the successful adoption, and also really trying to understand what they can do to help support the entire ecosystem of high quality information that investors would like reported. So I think that's also a very important point to note. So my message from that is, this is important. This is now. And the phrase that really resonates with me is, if you're standing still on sustainability, you're moving backwards. So without further ado, I think we've got a number of you that have joined. So what I wanted to do is just introduce my panel. Delighted to have a fab panel with me today. We've got Sue Lloyd, who is the Vice Chair of the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, or the ISSB, which I've heard it referred to, which is less of a mouthful. That's very exciting. Before that, she served as a member of the International Accounting Standards Board, the IASB, for a number of years. And she also served as chair of the IFRS Interpretations Committee. So she's been heavily involved in the establishment of the ISSB. So super experienced at everything to do with standards and IFRS. So I'm really excited to have her share with us an overview today. And then I'm also joined by Jonathan Lebray. And Jonathan, I notice a title change. I love it. Chief Connectivity and Integrated Reporting Officer at the Value Reporting Foundation. And I love that chief connectivity, because as we know, we've talked about this many times over the years, the challenge is to both internally connect the dots as well as externally connect the dots to the wider stakeholders in the ecosystem. So I'm super excited about that title, and I'm thinking about that for myself, actually. I might steal that from you. But anyway, Jonathan has 17 years of experience working in public policy, corporate governance, and regulation and accounting. Most recently, he was at the IIRC, responsible for global policy and strategy. And of course, IIRC is now merged into the Value Reporting Foundation and will soon become part of the ISSB. So interestingly, I just want to tell you a little story about Jonathan and I. We go back a long way, but actually I was thinking to myself, Jonathan, it must have been 7 or 8 years ago when we were having a conversation in the Helicon about what will the future of the IIRC hold. And one of the things we talked about, would it ever be adopted by IFRS? And that was really the long-term goal, wasn't it? And the dream. So your dreams come true, Jonathan. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what that means. So just before we kick off and I hand over to Sue, the way we're going to run this session is Sue and Jonathan are going to do some short presentations for about 20, 25 minutes. And then we are, sorry, my dog in the background, we are going to have a Q&A. So I'm really encouraging you to ask all those questions that you want to ask of Sue and Jonathan to really help you understand what's going on. And just before I kick off, I have a poll, hopefully, if I can find the polling, that I would really like everybody to do. I'm just going to launch the poll. So hopefully that's up on screen. If you can all vote just very quickly, that gives Sue and Jonathan a little bit of context as to who they're speaking to today. So that is super. Has that been launched? Can somebody confirm? Yes, okay, perfect. And then I'm going to hand over to Sue and Jonathan now. Thank you very much and look forward to catching up.
Thank you very much, Sally, and thanks for the opportunity and the wonderful introduction. We won't ask Jonathan whether it's a dream or a nightmare now. He's actually living the reality of being merged into the IFRS Foundation, but hopefully it's for the good for him and the rest of us. So what I want to do today between me and Jonathan is give you an idea of what it is that we are working on at the moment at the ISSB, and also an idea of what's in our exposure drafts. And I think Sally's message to me beforehand was don't be a geek. She didn't use those words, but I think that was the message I've received. So I'll do my very best. So moving on to the establishment of the International Sustainability Standards Board, and how did we end up with this new body? And I think what's really the message here is people wanted this. And so our trustees who oversee the IFRS Foundation, which is now the home of both the International Accounting Standards Board and the new Sustainability Board, went out and asked our stakeholders whether they wanted global sustainability standards for the capital markets. If so, whether the IFRS Foundation should play a role, and whether that role should be to set up a board within the foundation. And we got really overwhelming feedback from around the world across a variety of stakeholders that it would be really helpful for the foundation to do this. We got a lot of messages about how confusing the landscape was, both for companies preparing information and those using the information, with lots of alternative competing voluntary frameworks, and that the credibility of the foundation and our inclusive due process was something that would be helpful to bring to the party. And so that was the background for the establishment of the new board. So moving to the next slide. So that's what the foundation did. So at COP26, we were really excited with the announcement of the new board. Not the best kept secret in the market, but it was wonderful to have it announced there with the support of the finance ministers from around the world. And importantly, one of the things that was announced at the at COP26 was that as part of establishing the new board, we would try to reduce the alphabet soup. Sally was going through a whole myriad of acronyms there. We've created a new one with the ISSB, but we're trying to reduce them as well. We're consolidating with the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, the CDSB, and we're bringing on board the Value Reporting Foundation. So bringing in-house the IR framework, which Jonathan is so closely associated with, and the SASB sustainability standards. So trying to streamline things. And the other thing we did at COP26 was put out the first idea of what our standards might look like with what we call prototypes that really were the precursors to the exposure drafts that we published in March. So moving on to the next slide. So what's this new board all about? Well, in a nutshell, it is a board that's been established to really try to do for sustainability reporting for investors what the International Accounting Standards Board did for accounting, trying to improve the quality and the transparency of information provided, in this case about sustainability risks and opportunities, and trying to make that information comparable around the world. Now, we talk a lot about investors, and investors are really important to us because our focus is on the information that investors need to make investment decisions, and we hope to make good capital allocation decisions to help us all address our sustainability problems. But it's not just for investors. Really importantly, the ISSB is here for the efficiency of preparers. We want it to be possible for you to satisfy reporting requirements in multiple jurisdictions using the ISSB standards, rather than having different rules depending on where you're operating in different parts of the world. So there's a lot in this for preparers. And that's why we call this the global baseline of sustainability disclosures. The other sort of phrase we use a lot is the building blocks approach. And this is what we've tried to set out on this next page, the building blocks approach. And what do we mean by that? We try to explain this graphically. The big red block in the middle of this page is the work of the International Sustainability Standards Board, asking for sustainability disclosures to meet investors' needs that are designed to sit alongside the information in the financial statements and to connect well with that information. And Jonathan will talk a little bit more about that. We're really lucky with the International Sustainability Standards Board to sit alongside the International Accounting Standards Board, because what that means is that when we're writing the standards, we can make sure, working collectively, that for preparers, when they pick up the accounting standards and the sustainability standards, they work well together. But we also know that not every jurisdiction in the world is lucky enough to use our accounting standards. So we're designing the sustainability standards we're writing to be GAAP agnostic. So for example, an American company using US GAAP could also apply the International Sustainability Standard Board's standards. But moving on to the building blocks approach, what's this about? On the previous slide, sorry. The building blocks approach is about knowing that jurisdictions are also interested in sustainability, and that parties other than investors are interested in sustainability information. We know that it is likely to be the case that additional information might be necessary to meet a particular jurisdictional requirement or to meet an information need for a stakeholder other than investors. So for example, public policy needs. We want it to be possible for those needs to be met by using the ISSB standards with some incremental disclosures being added on, rather than having to apply two completely disconnected sets of requirements, again, to improve efficiency, particularly for preparers. So moving to the next slide. As I said, one of the really important things is the fact that we are in the same foundation as the International Accounting Standards Board. And so one of the things we're really interested in is the connection between the financial statements and the sustainability information. And Jonathan and I will both come back to that a little bit later on. So moving on. On to the next slide. So one of the other important things is that we are working in a noisy environment. If you're watching the sustainability space, you will know that at the moment we've got our exposure drafts out for comment. The SEC has also put out climate proposals, and Europe, EFRAG, have put out a range of sustainability disclosure requirements. So it's quite a crowded field at the moment. So that's quite hard work, but it's also a good opportunity. One of the things that we're doing at the ISSB is trying to work with these different parties around the world with the objective of bringing our proposals closer together, again, for the efficiency of reporting around the world. So we've established a working group. Our first meeting will actually be next week. That includes the SEC and Europe, but also China, Japan, and the UK. And we want to bring our proposals closer together. And you can help us by writing to the Europeans and to the SEC to say that you think it would be good for us to be aligned, if that's what you think as well. So moving to the next slide. The other global player in this field is the Global Reporting Initiative, who are focused on the needs of users of information beyond just investors. We again want to be working with them to create compatibility between what they require and what we require. So we've announced a memorandum of understanding, which means that we're going to work in partnership with GRI to see if we can identify disclosure requirements that would be sufficient to meet investor needs, that can also be used by GRI as part of what they require. Again, this building block approach to try to improve the efficiency of reporting. And moving on to the next slide. Now I'm going to start talking a little bit about our exposure drafts. And what I really want to do here is to pick up on the big themes in our exposure drafts. What are the key things that we're focusing on? So the first thing to note is that we've got 2 exposure drafts, and they set out the sort of framework for the type of information that the new board is going to ask for about sustainability risks and opportunities. So on the left-hand side of the diagram is something that you will see in both of our exposure drafts, asking for information about sustainability risks and opportunities by providing information about how a company governs those risks and opportunities, its strategy for dealing with them, its risk management approach, and the metrics and targets it uses to identify its current position, to set targets for the future, and then assess how well a company performs against its targets. Sally was talking about, her passion for the governance and the management aspects of things. One of the things I personally really hope will come out of these exposure drafts is that by asking for this information, we're going to really encourage conversations within companies about managing and governing these risks and opportunities. So it's not just about disclosure. Talking about the architecture of the suite of standards, on the right-hand side, you can see the sort of structure which shows the relationship between these 2 EDs. The General Requirements Standard sets out the general principles, if you like, for the disclosures about sustainability risks and opportunities, and it's going to be accompanied by a series of specific disclosure requirements. The first set of proposed specific disclosure requirements are the climate disclosures in the second exposure draft. But this gives you an idea of the structure of our standards, and later in the year, we'll ask you for what you think we should work on next after climate. Moving to the next slide. So the General Requirements Exposure Draft, Draft S1, sets out the overarching proposal that companies should be required to provide information on all of their significant sustainability risks and opportunities. So not just climate, but all of the significant sustainability risks and opportunities. Moving to the next slide. And we ask for that information to be provided for the different risks and opportunities through this governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets lens that we've taken from the Tcfd recommendations, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. We've borrowed their structure and we're using this. Moving to the next slide. Now, you might think that it's difficult to know what to do if I only provide you with climate disclosures and I ask you to report on all of your significant sustainability risks and opportunities. But in our General Requirements Exposure Draft, we explain how that should be approached. And that's by using the benefit of integrating our work with that of the Value Reporting Foundation and the Climate Disclosure Standards Board. If we haven't written a standard yet, so if you're trying to report on something other than climate, you should look at the SASB standards and the CDSB materials to work out which sustainability related risks and opportunities to think about and what disclosures might be appropriate for investors. And we've got an example in the appendix to the General Requirements document on how to go through that process. Moving to the next slide. Now, probably the main question I get when I'm out talking to people about our new proposals is, is it about double materiality like Europe, or is it about something else? And the answer is that we're focused on information necessary to meet investors' information needs. And in particular, what we're focused on is the information that would help an investor really understand how a company's share price or the market value of its debt might be affected by sustainability risks and opportunities looking into the future. We call that enterprise value. As I said, we're asking for information on significant sustainability risks and opportunities. So as preparers, I'm not making you think about, every possible sustainability risk and opportunity you can possibly imagine. I just want to know about the stuff that could really affect your performance going forward. Now, the second question I often get asked is, well, if you only care about what investors need to assess enterprise value, does that mean you don't care about the impact of a company on people, on the economy, and on the planet? And the answer to that is no, I do care about the impact of a company on people, the economy, and the planet when it affects assessments of enterprise value. And it's increasingly the case that if a company is affecting people, the economy, and the planet, investors care as well. And that's because it gives rise to regulation and it gives rise to reputational risks. Customers don't want to buy things from companies with bad reputations. They increasingly care about that. So that affects enterprise value. And importantly, we do use the word material, but just to identify, the information that really matters. The same way that you have to think about, screening for the really important stuff when you prepare your financial statements. Moving to the next slide and highlighting a couple of key things here. One is that we really care about the linkages between the financial statements and the sustainability information. I think when I talk to investors, the main frustration they express to me at the moment is that they don't really get how a company can have, for example, a particular strategy for their carbon emissions, and it seems that it has no consequence in their financial statements. Investors want to understand how what they're reading in the sustainability information makes sense compared with what they can see in the financial statements. And that's something that we really emphasize in our exposure draft. And because of the linkage between these pieces of information, we're proposing that the financial statements and the sustainability information be provided at the same time within the general purpose financial reporting. Moving to the next slide. So moving on to the climate exposure draft, which gets a lot of the airtime. And so this document you would use if you'd picked up my first exposure draft and concluded that climate was a significant risk for you. And I basically expect everybody to reach that conclusion. And this document asks for information about physical risks from climate change. So for example, the risk of flood, the transition risks. So what might you need to do differently running your business in the future because of climate change? But also what opportunities might you have as a result of climate change? Have you got new technology that others don't have that you may be able to benefit from? Moving to the next slide. And overall, we're really looking for information to enable investors to understand particular things about companies. Firstly, what's the effect of climate on a company's share price and net debt? What is the company doing to manage its climate risk? And information to enable investors to really step back and think, okay, do I think the company has got the ability to adapt its planning and business model to deal with the uncertainty of climate risk? Are they thinking about the right things? They really want to understand the story that a company has to tell about how it's dealing with climate risk. Moving forward to the next slide. Now, one really important message that we got when we were setting up the new board is whatever you do, don't start with a clean sheet of paper. We're not interested in you being novel. We'd like you to build on the work that's already been done by others. And so you'll see that very much when you pick up our climate exposure draft. The front part of our exposure draft is really based on the Tcfd recommendations. We've enhanced them, we've made the language more enforceable, but it's very much based on the Tcfd recommendations. So here in the UK, where the government's looking at the mandating Tcfd recommendations, that's a wonderful precursor to applying our climate exposure draft. The back part of our climate document is industry-based requirements. 66 different chapters for different industries and activities, which means that a company can have a look and identify the particular chapters relevant to its business and find the metrics and information to meet investors' information needs. Moving on to the next page. I'll just highlight a couple of the specific disclosures that are proposed for climate. One is information about a company's emissions targets and how they plan to achieve them. Are you going to reduce your emissions? Are you planning to use offsets? What are you planning to do? So that investors can assess how credible they think the plan is and whether they like the plan. Do they like the approach that a company is taking to dealing with carbon, or would they rather they did something different? The second thing we were asking for is information about the resilience of a company's business strategy to climate change. In different climate scenarios, what might a company do? And really, how is a company thinking through that uncertainty about how climate might pan out? And last but not least, one of the important proposals is asking for information on greenhouse gas emissions, Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Moving to the next page. So our final standard is going to be heavily influenced by the quality of the information that you give us. And we're really, really keen to hear from preparers about what might be difficult for you to do, how long it might take for you to do it, what information you think resonates with you from a management perspective, to help inform our redeliberations when we finalise what we put out for application. You've got till the end of July, 29th of July, to come back to us, and you can either send us a letter or we have an electronic survey online, whichever is the easiest for you. Moving to the next page. The next things that are going to be coming out from me are some work on the digital taxonomy, which is going to be used to tag the information for electronic reporting for the sustainability disclosure proposals. We're going to work on internationalizing the SASB standards so that they are applicable around the world. And last but certainly not least, we're going to be really interested to hear from our stakeholders what they'd like us to work on next. Really it's your chance to tell me what you'd like me to work on next. So look out for that consultation. Now I'm going to hand over to Jonathan.
Thank you, Sue. And it's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to briefly outline where integrated reporting and the SASB standards will fit into the new architecture once the Value Reporting Foundation is consolidated with the IFRS Foundation later this year. First, as Sally said, it has very much been a long-standing dream and objective of the IIRC, the organisation that I was formerly working for, to really have achieved this moment where we would be able to close the IIRC and become part of a much bigger global picture as part of the IFRS Foundation, because we have always believed that that will help to achieve scale and also greater legitimacy over the adoption of the principles and concepts that are included in the integrated reporting framework. And our goal has always been to see a world where there was a global, comprehensive corporate reporting system. And so within the IFRS Foundation, the framework will play two roles. As now, it will provide the concepts and principles to support the preparation of an annual integrated report. Second, and perhaps more strategically importantly, will contribute to the connectivity between the work of the two boards, the IASB and the ISSB. The general requirements prototype emphasizes the importance of linking information in financial statements and sustainability related disclosures, which is one of the core principles and fundamental concepts of integrated reporting. Our global IR Council will be repositioned as an advisory body to both the IFRS Foundation trustees and both boards on connectivity and the practice of integrated reporting. So the foundation and both boards will get input from our stakeholder community at a leadership level on the practice of integrated reporting and the trends in different markets. And further work is already underway on identifying the linkages between management commentary and the integrated reporting framework. On the SASB standard side, they will be the starting point for the industry-specific requirements and will go through ISSB due process. And the advisory groups, the SASB advisory groups that provide market input and participation in the standard setting process, will be repositioned as part of the ISSB. So from both a SASB standards and an integrated reporting perspective, the purpose is very much to build on existing developments and ensure that we retain the commitment and support of the very many businesses and investors around the world who've contributed to our work so far. Thank you. And Sally, with that, I'll hand back to you.
Okay, super, fantastic. Both Sue and Jonathan, really fantastic overview, an awful lot to take in. So what I wanted to do is the questions are coming in really quickly, which is fabulous. We've got lots of questions to ask. So if we don't get through all the questions today, I just wanted to say we'll try to take them offline and get back to you on any answers. But what I wanted to start with, just from the very beginning, is a bit of a jargon buster, because looking at the attendees today, we've got, you know, probably less than a quarter of the people are actually finance people. So I'm not entirely sure that everybody will be quite familiar with standards and what standards actually mean. So I wondered if we could just take a minute, Sue, if you could just explain what are standards and why do we need them? And specifically, what is the difference between standards and frameworks? And how do those fit together? And I think that would just reiterate it. I know you did talk a little bit about it, but I think it would be really helpful just to pause and explain the significance of what standards are. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and let's see how I go answering it. So I think the really important thing about standards and what we're really trying to do here with the International Sustainability Standards Board is making sure that we're setting up a sort of a formal basis for reporting. So in the same way that if you're preparing a set of financial statements, you have to pick up a set of requirements, and then auditors come along and check that you've done what you're supposed to have done to comply with the standards, and they can check that it's accurate. And then regulators come along and make sure you've done the right thing. And then investors can say, okay, I feel better now because I know that it's a good job. We're trying to bring that sort of formality and enforceability into the sustainability world. And so if I look at the TCFD recommendations, that's probably a really good place to start. So the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, to get through my jargon busting, started out as a set of recommendations, as it says on the tin, good ideas for reporting on climate. And if you look actually at the analysis that the TCFD does periodically on what people are doing, lots of people say they apply the TCFD recommendations, but some of them are just applying one or two pieces out of a whole myriad of recommendations. And also, they're often phrased as ideas for the types of information that it might be good to provide. And so what we have done is we've come along and we've picked up the TCFD recommendations, we've built on them, so we've made them more specific, so that if somebody now is applying the climate exposure draft, even though it's based on TCFD, they'd have to do the whole thing. They couldn't choose the 3 paragraphs that they like. They'd have to do it in a very particular way, because we've been very particular with what it is you have to do. And now the wording is very precise. So that means we've created the foundation for somebody to come along and say, you know, a regulator can come along and say, okay, yes, tick, you've done what was asked. And somebody can come along from an assurance perspective, an auditor or somebody else, and say, yes, that's compliant. And that then gives us the basis for that solid foundation where investors can say, okay, I'm confident now that I can use this information to make investment decisions, and I can validly compare what company A and company B have done. And that's really the difference.
Super. Okay, I think that was really helpful and really simplified it. So thank you for that. Okay, next one. Another jargon buster, and it's something that comes up a lot, and I know you spent a bit of time on it, but it is that issue of materiality and the approach to materiality. And again, the term that comes up, and I know you did sort of define it, but I think it would help just to redefine it again, is enterprise value, because I think that's it's a new term for a lot of people. What does that mean, very simply, and what does that mean in terms of when you're approaching materiality?
Yes, and this is a harder one. You're working your way up, Sally. So enterprise value, we came up with a very specific definition. We say in the exposure draft that enterprise value means the value of a company's equity, its shares, and the value of its net debt. So we're trying to get at what would you pay to invest in this company? That's what enterprise value really is. And so what we're saying is we want you to provide information that investors need to understand to work out how much they'd be willing to pay for your shares or for your debt. You know, what do they think you're worth? So it's not the value of the company to mankind, it's how much would you pay to invest in this company is what's particular about the focus. And so that's what enterprise value means. And then we come along and use the word materiality. And unfortunately, other people are using the word materiality in a very different way, notably in Europe, to sort of describe what type of information they want. We use materiality the way that an accountant would use it when they prepare their financial statement. So the way that I like to think about it, and you can tell me whether it's helpful jargon buster or not, is I might start out and say, okay, now I know I need information about climate. I know I need information about climate that would help an investor think about how much they'd pay for my shares. And I might come up with 20 pieces of information that might be sort of relevant to that assessment. Now I need to work out, okay, of these 20 pieces of information, which do I really think is so important that it might change the decision an investor might make about whether they'll invest in me or not, or the price they'd pay for my shares? Like, is it important enough that an investor would actually notice it? That's, to me, what the materiality question is that we're asking.
Okay, I think that was really helpful. Thank you. Okay, last jargon buster before we go on, and maybe this is one for you, Jonathan. It's the word, and I hope I say it right, interoperability. It's a bit of a tongue twister, I think that one is used a lot in the context of talking about standards and how they come together with everything else going on in the marketplace. And there's a number of questions in already about how does ISSB relate to what's happening with the SEC, with FRAG. So maybe you could explain that word in the context of, you know, the wider landscape.
Yes, of course, and I'm sure Sue as well has a perspective on this question as well. I mean, looking at it from just the brief kind of recent history, I think the corporate reporting landscape has been, as Sue said at the beginning, really been an alphabet soup, and there have been different standards and frameworks that have developed, and almost in parallel and in silos from one another, and therefore there was really no connection or interoperability. We then had, about 5 years ago, something called the Corporate Reporting Dialogue, which helped to bring a lot of the global standards setters together to really understand what the differences were in terms of the definitions, getting the definitions more aligned, some of the terminology aligned. And I think that is the first step towards interoperability. But for me, what I often think of interoperability as being about is about compatibility. So it isn't about trying to harmonize or to create one standard. It's about recognizing that different standards will exist for different audiences, but what we need is one system. So let's make sure that through the building blocks approach that Sue outlined, that we have that global baseline for capital markets, but where a jurisdiction maybe wishes to introduce a standard that is relevant to a broader set of stakeholders, let's make sure that the definitions and the concepts are aligned to that broader global baseline so that there is compatibility between that global baseline that we want to be universally applied and jurisdiction-specific requirements. So it's getting that compatibility right. And the working group that Sue outlined is part and parcel of bringing everyone together in order to bring order to that.
Super. Sue, did you want to add anything to that? No? Okay, super. Great. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to launch, now that we've had sort of our jargon buster, I'm going to launch a bit of a polling question. We've got a couple of polling questions that I appreciate everybody to answer. Some of them pick up on some of those words, interoperability and enterprise value. So hopefully it gives you context for the questions. If you could quickly answer those, that would be great. And it gives Sue and Jonathan just a minute to run through the loads of questions that we've got coming through, which I will try to consolidate in the meantime. And one of the things that I wanted to also just touch on, maybe while people are answering those questions, is just to get into the practical sort of dealing with the actual standards. And so, you went through very thoroughly how you've published 2 standards, a general requirements and a climate. Maybe you could just explain a little bit about how preparers should be viewing and prioritizing this from a practical perspective, in terms of how they should approach them or how they would use them. And then also, if you could just elaborate on what does the future hold in terms of additional standards. Will there be additional standards coming out for different issues like water or biodiversity, those sorts of things? It would be great to just set that context of what practically, what do companies do now? Do they start with the general standard? And then if they deem climate to be material, I know you suggested it should be material for most companies, but somebody in the questions has actually said in the SASB metrics, it's not material for their sector. So does that mean that they don't need to do it? So just to try to wrap all those questions up, if I could.
Okay, so in terms of what you can usefully do at the moment, I think that getting familiar with the exposure drafts, of course, I would say that's a good thing. And if you feel compelled to write to us, even better, get involved in the debate, because you can influence now. If something's difficult, I won't know unless you tell me. So get involved in the debate. I think the other thing that is really helpful to prepare for our standards is anything that you're doing already or are planning to do in terms of, for example, starting to apply the Tcfd recommendations or using Jonathan's integrated reporting framework or using the SASB standards. All of that is really good way to sort of on-ramp, if you like, to the journey ahead, because we're building from all of those things. So I think you can sort of build up from there. In terms of what's coming next, and what can people expect, the expectation is that the ISSB will build out more specific disclosure requirements over time. So we started with climate first because people told us that was the most urgent, but we said not climate only. And so we are going to ask stakeholders for what they think we should work on next. But the expectation would be that we'll move on to new topics next. And that's likely to be a combination of themes-based things. So people often talk about water or biodiversity or just transition or something like that, human capital. But sometimes people talk about very industry-specific things. So particularly people who are used to the SASB standards, they like the fact that it's developed to be very focused on a few key metrics by industry, and they may have very particular information needs they want to focus on. So I think it'll be a combination of those things. And yes, I said most people should conclude that climate is material. And somebody's rightly pointed out perhaps that there isn't something for their industry for the SASB standards, which is interesting. But I do think it's probably sometimes knowing that something isn't going to have an effect is material information. So if, for example, you're a company where you've concluded that actually climate isn't really going to cause you to change your business model, that can be an interesting piece of information for an investor, because it means that you've got less uncertainty in your business model than a company that does have to adjust for climate change. So maybe that's something to talk about, the fact that actually we've gone through a process of assessment and concluded that we don't need to do anything. That can be information in itself. So just something to think about.
Super helpful. Okay. I'm just going to very quickly share these results because I think they're interesting. Hopefully you can see them there. And I think actually they're particularly interesting because I think that it really does show you that I think people really need to respond to the consultation and have their voices heard, because there are some things that I think we're all in agreement that we should focus on this interoperability, which makes sense. I think there's mixed views in terms of materiality and the focus on materiality moving forward. I think we're all in agreement on sustainability reporting deadlines should be aligned with financial reporting period. That makes sense, and that will help connectivity. And then mandatory assurance, I think generally everybody is quite in agreement about that. But what I wanted to pick up on next is there's a couple of questions around how this actually works. Now, as we all well know that many companies are at very different stages of their journey when it comes to sustainability. So what would be helpful is, what is your expectation of companies, and what would be some practical advice for those that are, not so advanced on the journey? And then on the flip side of that, for large corporates, PLCs, is there an expectation that sustainability reporting moves from sitting within a sustainability team to risks and finance teams? as the data becomes, more focused on risk and the rigor involved in the process. So that's just combining a couple of questions from the questions there. Sue, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of, what do we expect from companies, I think what's really a really important question in both of the exposure drafts is how much time do you need to apply these documents? We need hard evidence from you guys about, what do you need to do to prepare to apply this? And the more facts you can give me, the better. If you say you need 10 years and you give me no extra information, I'm going to raise my eyebrows. But if you say, I need X period of time, and that's because I need to gather this data, which is difficult, I need to make these systems changes, I need to, develop this expertise, the more facts you can give me to help understand that, the better I can help you in terms of a reasonable timeline. So that's really important. I think in terms of getting ready for the reporting, I think even taking the first steps towards making sure you have the right people and processes in place to start the right conversations about governance, risk management, strategy. The data is what everybody sort of starts to think about immediately and panic about a little bit, but there's actually a lot of that sort of management process that you can do before you even have any of those things. And maybe that helps you set up the right conversations internally and helps you really drill down into, okay, what actually do I need? Let's get serious with this conversation. So I really would encourage those conversations. And then the last thing you asked about, and I'd be interested actually in Jonathan's view on this as well, because I'm sure he speaks to a lot of people too, in terms of, is it the sustainability people or does it change? My sense is that by trying to move sustainability reporting really to the mainstream of corporate reporting with the sort of credibility that I was talking about earlier, it makes the sort of finance knowledge and functions and experience increasingly relevant. So I think it steers it more in that direction than it might have been traditionally. Also, investor interest is increasing, so that maybe steers it in that direction a little bit as well. But I think you're still going to need your sustainability people as well. I know that for me, coming from the International Accounting Standards Board, even though I've learned a lot in the last, period of time working on sustainability, I've still got a lot to learn. So it's great to have those finance skills, but working in partnership with people with sustainability knowledge, I think is really important.
Yeah, and absolutely. Just building on that. I agree with Sue, and I think we're increasingly getting to the stage now where there are more multidisciplinary teams. And I think at the beginning, certainly of the integrated reporting journey, it made a big difference at the start, whether it was the sustainability team that began the journey or whether it was the finance team. But actually, I think the starting point has, in a funny sort of way, become less important than how quickly, if it does start with sustainability, they are able to break down the silo between themselves and the finance team and the strategy team to make sustainability strategically important to the business and then start to influence decisions at the board level and the management level. And just to pick up on the journey point as well, at the VRF, we brought out recently a set of integrated thinking principles. And what they are is really a guide, how you break down the silos internally within your organization to really get those connections going between different operational units within the organization to get that conversation started. So hopefully that's a useful practical tool.
Okay, super. Yeah, and just combining another couple of questions that really follow on from that. Is this the beginning of the end for the standalone sustainability report? Or where should the ISSB disclosure sit? I think that's the big challenge for a lot of people on the call, because as we well know from the work we do with clients, is many companies have 4 or 5 different reports: annual report, a sustainability report, TCFD report, a net zero report, a transition plan, all those. So how do you envision this moving forward with ISSB standards?
Well, from our side in the general requirements exposure draft, we've been intentionally sort of neutral on location. So we say that the sustainability related financial disclosures need to be included within the general purpose financial reporting. And then we're not more specific. And that's really on purpose, because we want to make sure that if a particular jurisdiction adopting the ISSB standards has a specific location that they require, that we don't cause conflict with those with the local regulation. And I thought it was really interesting actually in the FRC webcast this morning, Sally, which I think you were listening to as well, to hear them saying that in the consultation that they plan to run later this year, location is one of the specific questions that they're going to ask. And they, I think, mentioned, correct me if I'm wrong, whether it should be included within the strategic report in the annual report, or whether it should be in a separate sustainability risk section. And so I think it's an open question in the UK, but we've sort of sat on the fence on purpose.
Okay, that's helpful. And you're absolutely right. They did say that. And I think they also mentioned that the lab might be embarking on a project to do some investigation around that, which I think will be really helpful. So watch that space. Couple of questions on timeframes and audit profession and regulators in terms of, will they be adequately resourced to carry out the additional assurance work on sustainability standards alongside traditional audit? Because presumably this will all need to be done together at the same time and interconnected. So I wonder if you could just spend, I know audit is top of mind for a lot of people, so just maybe very quickly address that.
Yeah, a couple of points. Firstly, it's not within the ISSB's remit what sort of happens on the assurance front, in the same way that financial statements are typically subject to audit. We don't dictate that. That's usually a legal or a regulatory requirement in a particular jurisdiction. But of course, we're interested in what happens on the assurance front. So we're working closely with the International Audit Assurance Standards Board to see what they're thinking. But I think there's an open question in terms of what the nature of the assurance should be and who should do it. So, we sort of automatically say auditors and assurance, but maybe it doesn't need to be an auditor. Maybe it's a different skill set that actually is appropriate for verifying sustainability information, because it's a different type of information. And I think that's an open conversation. And I think that that's going to be something that the audit assurance people will be looking at in detail to make sure they've got in place what they need to support it, if it is auditors. But also, I think regulators will be looking in jurisdictions at what they might say about assurance. So, for example, in the SEC's proposals on climate, there's a whole long section on what they propose from an assurance perspective and how they plan to sort of ramp it up over time so that it becomes sort of more serious over time, if you like. Clearly, taking into consideration the point, which I think is behind the question you were asked, was, is there really the resource and capacity to support this immediately? And so I think that's an open question, and one we're really watching closely.
And also the skill set and experience, I'd say, knowledge. Okay, great. There is quite a few questions and concern around how ISSB is working with the EU and the SEC to ensure that preparers aren't feeling overwhelmed. And I know you both addressed it a little bit. Would be great maybe just to reinforce some of the things that are happening and what that might mean for corporates. Jonathan, I know you felt quite strongly about this.
Absolutely, and I think this is something that you can hear not only from the standard setting organisations, but also from the market as well, that we need to absolutely make sure that we're in the design phase with 3 global consultations out at the moment with the ISSB, the SEC and EFRAG. We are at a moment of opportunity where we can design a system where there is this compatibility or interoperability. I think Sue set out some of the practical steps that are being taken in terms of convening the working group of the different organizations around the world, the different regulators and standard setters around the world, to try and forge the conversation. But I think what I would say is that and I'm coming from outside the ISSB at the moment, we'll be shortly part of the ISSB, but as an observer at the moment, what I can say is that the level of commitment to this interoperability, I've never seen it before in the 10 years that I've been involved in the corporate reporting system. It's not just a commitment from the standard setters, it's also an absolute call from the market. So I think, as we've got these consultations, please, if you are going to be responding to these consultations, please make this point in your consultations, because it's really important that it is a message that is heard loud and clear.
Super, that's really helpful. Okay, I have another couple of questions, but what are the 2 or 3 key challenges you think are facing listed companies in corporate reporting over the next few years? clearly, you know, we've outlined this, but what do you think that actually means for companies moving forward, and what else is sort of on the horizon that we need to be preparing for as the market's moving so quickly on this? Standards are the first step, and I think there's probably multiple steps to be taken.
I can have a go with a couple of things, and then Jonathan, I'm sure you'll have a perspective as well. So I think it's building up skills and understanding, I think, is a really important area. So, you know, just getting your head around the idea of, you know, how do I think about sustainability risks and what drives my value of my shares? I mean, that's a journey in itself, right? So I think that's something, making sure you've got people capable of thinking through those things and developing skills in-house or hiring people. And then I think the other thing is going to be working out where you're going to get the data and the information that you need to meet the reporting requirements. It's new, you know, so this whole like scope 3, it's quite tricky to think through. So I think that's a journey that's going to take some time. Jonathan, do you think, have you got any other insights that I've missed?
I think the only other one that I would add as well is really the linkage between the information and the governance, so the decision making and making sure that internal piece is also looked after. I think that's really a challenge. I think everyone in theory gets the importance of it, but actually making that happen in practice can be a real challenge.
Super. I'm just conscious of time, and there's no way we're going to get to all these questions, so we will try to come back to you on them. But I just wanted to ask a couple final questions before we end and launch a final poll for everyone to do while I'm asking the final questions. And really, I think it would be really helpful, and Sue, I think you've outlined quite a few of these things, but if there are 2 or 3 takeaways for corporates today, bearing in mind that they're all very involved in the preparation stages of reporting. And within that, how can corporates, or what can corporates do to support the success of the ISSB?
I think the single most helpful thing that corporates can do is really get behind the push for the global baseline. If you have any opportunity to do that, you can answer the SEC's question on allowing the use of the ISSB standards in the US. Question 189, if you're looking for it in their big long document, sending that message to Europe, explaining why it's important for companies that happens, and why, you know, we should spend our time, you know, managing these risks, not complying with different reporting regimes. I think that's the most important thing. You can really influence change at the moment. We've got a unique opportunity. And then the second most important thing is really getting involved in our proposals. As I said before, you really can influence outcomes at the moment. You know, if you come to me in a year's time and tell me something's really hard, it's much harder for me to unpick it going backwards. Whereas now I want to hear, and I'm open, all ears, to what I can do to assist. So really getting involved in the discussion, either individually or through industry groups, all really, really important.
Super. Jonathan, do you want to add anything to that? Covered. Okay, then I have, just as we do the final point, I've got one final question for each of you. If you had the opportunity to get a message back to the boards of these companies, because I know from our experience, some of the challenges often are with boards and really taking, you know, reporting on seriously, because this change is really a mindset change and a behavior change that has to happen throughout the organization. It's going to require an awful lot more resource. It's going to cost an awful lot more time, a lot of things. So what would the message be to the boards of these sort of FTSE 350 listed companies that we're talking to today?
For me, the thing I think that's really important is to approach this sort of sustainability reporting journey not as a, oh my gosh, I've got new reporting requirements I have to comply with, but really seeing it as an opportunity to get the people who really make decisions in your organization to focus on the risks that need to be managed. Like, let's make this an opportunity to elevate these discussions and get the powerful people, decision makers who move resources, involved in really thinking about this things, really affecting this change and really bringing it into the way you manage your business and think about things. Don't you know, send it down to the people crunching numbers and say, can you look after this? You know, grab the opportunity to really make this something that's in the whole business. That's what my message.
Super, great message. I love it. And Jonathan?
And I think allied to that is the opportunity message as well, which is there's an abundance of capital in our capital markets waiting for a home. We heard it from all the major institutional investors who attended COP26 that they're looking for homes for their investments. You know, the commitments that drive towards more sustainable business models is going to attract a lot of capital over the next few years. So get ready, be prepared, and seize that opportunity, because the capital is there waiting for a home. And information for capital markets can help to link the capital to the sustainable business models of the future.
Absolutely. So actually, to summarize, perfect summary, thank you both. And as I always like to see this as an opportunity and not an obligation, because I think there really is a huge opportunity in all this. So thank you very much, Sue. Thank you, Jonathan. Great session. We tackled a lot of the questions. We didn't get through them all, but we'll see what we can do in terms of following up for everyone. I know Naomi's just popped into the chat box our upcoming event. So please, we'd love you to see you there. Our Trends in Corporate Reporting Research, June 9th, and then our Web 100 on June 21st. And then of course, our annual event with the FRC in September, which we will be holding live. So we'd love to invite you all to join us for a half-day session with them in September. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a great rest of the day, and we'll be in contact soon.